Hello, thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to talk to you about future-proofing procurement with the emphasis on talent, skills and creating AI-ready teams, because I believe that the organisations that win with tech are those that invest in their people. And I'm going to provide you with some evidence to support that theory today. Okay, so what we're going to talk about. We're going to start with the findings of the research I published last October into digital procurement skills. Then we're going to look at the impact of AI and what's moved on in that 9 months since that publication. We're then going to touch on the challenges and the opportunities that it creates for procurement leaders before I'll revisit my very enjoyable trip to New York last month to Digital Procurement World, where the theme of the event was putting AI to work. And I'll share with you some of the findings, some excellent presentations that I observed at that event. That will lead us on to the subject of future workforce planning, which in turn will take us to talent attraction, a subject very close to my heart. Why is that? Well, for those of you who don't know me, I am Andrew Daley, and I'm a specialist in the world of digital procurement, supply chain recruitment. I recruit across the entire digital procurement supply chain ecosystem, so that's for software vendors, consultancies, and end user corporate procurement supply chain teams. And increasingly in recent times, because of my research into this area, I found myself also in demand as a talent and skills advisor. And a lot of that is because I get to work across Europe and America, and I come into contact with a vast range of very intelligent, insightful people. They share their knowledge with me, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of that knowledge with you today. So, I mentioned our digital skills research, which we published last October. My journey in this area really dates back to 2018. At that point, I was asked by one of my customers at the time, Basware, you may know them as AP automation business, to present at their London conference. And they gave me the presentation title of Climbing the Career Ladder in an Automated World. And at the time, being honest, I had to do quite a lot of research to try and find out what that meant in terms of future skills and everything else that goes around that. And there are really two things I want to share from that point in time. The first was that all my research pointed towards the fact that no one really knew what those skills were, and certainly no one was investing or prioritising resources to try and develop their people in an area, which led me to make a recommendation to my audience that it was on them to learn about this. They had to adopt a growth mindset, employ their own intellectual curiosity, and get out there and learn from the vast range of resources that are available: white papers, webinars, YouTube videos, etc. In the intervening years, I've attended a really large number of conferences in both Europe and America, and I've always had this conversation with both software leaders, consultants, and procurement leaders about what does digital skill set look like. And that culminated in a conversation I had in February of 2024 with Atosha Thurman, the inspirational CMO of SAP Ariba. She was in London for their event. I was fortunate to have a chat with her, and I explained to her, I said, look, I find that there's not really enough investment yet in these digital skills. Of course, that is impacting adoption. And Atosha was very much the mindset that she agreed with me and was excited by my findings from my sort of anecdotal research. And so much so, she invited me to speak at SAP Spend Connect in Vegas in October of last year. Now, heading over to the States for such a big conference, I felt I needed to equip myself with more than just all my anecdotal research. So I decided to embark on a formal research project where I interviewed over 30 procurement leaders from what I consider to be elite functions and functions that were leading the way in the adoption of digital tools. I also spoke to some of their digital leaders and some consultancies and a few of the software vendors as well, to get a broad picture of what the future of digital skills would look like for procurement. And this is what we found. We found that the number one skill set in demand would be digital literacy. What do I mean by that? We use digital literacy in our personal and our professional lives. In very simple terms, it's our ability to navigate around the interfaces we face. Now, in our consumer lives, with things like Amazon and Netflix and other things we use, that's relatively straightforward. The UX is very seamless and user-friendly. That's not always the case with business software, particularly legacy software that can be quite clunky. We all know someone in the team who's pretty good at that, others less so. So the desire to get people more effective at navigating their way around business software was certainly seen as very desirable by all the people we researched with. Now, the next phase of that really is technological proficiency. That's similar but different in the sense that it goes into a depth of expertise in a particular area. And that will often be enabled by technology. And a great example of that, probably the best example in procurement, would be data and analytics. We all know the importance of data analytics in procurement these days. So data fluency, analytical capability, analytical literacy, very, very desirable. But there were other parts of the procurement skill set which were historically very important that have also evolved with technology. I'll give you two examples: negotiation and risk. So there are other skills that we've featured in the research, and you're more than welcome to contact me to get a copy of that. But I want to move on now to the human skills that were also highlighted as being very, very important in the future of the digital procurement skill set. And these are skills which, again, historically have been very important in procurement, but have become more so with the advent of technology. And the starting point there would be strategic and critical thinking. Two skills that are absolutely vital. When you think about critical thinking, you get outputs from whatever technology solution you got. You need a human oversight to assess whether you really agree with that, how you're going to use it, how you're going to interpret it. So they're both very important qualities. If I date back to I made the point I started in purchasing recruitment in 1998. The very first brief I got for head of purchasing, the top skill set I was asked to find was stakeholder engagement. Relationship management's always been vital, whether it be stakeholders, communicating up and down the organisation, or over into suppliers. Humans want to deal with humans. That's not been automated yet. AI has not quite managed to take that away from us just yet. And so relationship management, absolutely vital, and increasingly so because we want to head into the era of business partnering, where we're getting a deeper understanding, a deeper embedding in the organisation. And all this spare time that we're meant to have as a result of technology doing the heavy lifting for us means that we've got more time to invest in the business and move beyond the classic sort of procurement areas of cost saving, sourcing, supply management into more value add type activities. And really, the other thing that I want to highlight, and it goes back to my earlier point about my own research back in 2018, was the importance of intellectual curiosity. Absolutely everyone in our research highlighted this as being a very, very desirable trait because things are moving at pace, and that growth mindset that comes from intellectual curiosity is vital if we're going to keep pace with that, and we're going to touch on that more as we move on through this presentation. So that's what we found back in the summer of last year, published in October. But things have moved on, and they've moved on at a pace. And now we're into the era of particularly agentic AI. We all know about agentic AI for a couple of years now, but agentic is here, and that's really shifting the landscape, I think. And so we're starting to use different language about these skills. So if you take the point I make about intellectual curiosity, we're now talking more about adaptive intelligence, and intellectual curiosity is a part of that adaptive intelligence. But adaptive intelligence is when you've got a high AQ, adaptability quotient. What does that mean? Well, I've got some notes down here that I'm going to look at, and we're talking about the ability about learning agility, and that's not just learning new things; that's also moving on from old ways of thinking. We talk about creative solutions to unexpected challenges and a growth mindset. We live in a world where things are changing rapidly, particularly with AI. But also, we had the pandemic, and procurement supply chain had to make a rapid response to that. And that was a question of making up things as we go along because we'd never experienced that before. Similarly, we've got, unfortunately, global conflicts at the moment. We've had tariffs so far this year. Things change quickly, and the ability to adapt and find creative ways of dealing with that is a vital part of adaptive intelligence. And I encourage you to go away and Google what adaptive intelligence is so you get a broader understanding. But I think you get a flavour of what I've just said there. Because really, we're heading to an era where digital literacy is important, but we're now heading towards what we term AI fluency. If I talk about AI literacy and AI fluency, what's the difference? I think AI literacy, for me, in my mind now, is that people are capable of using AI. It might be meeting recordings, it might be polishing an email, it might be asking questions that you might have previously asked of Google to get different answers. And a lot of people have now got that degree of AI literacy. But we need to embrace AI fluency, and that's a different mindset, and we're going to touch on what that means in a moment in terms of collaboration, understand how to get the best out of the models, and really starting to think about AI as a colleague rather than a software tool. Because we're in an era whereby we're moving from task execution as humans into collaborating with agents. We're now experimenting with human and AI workflows rather than purely human workflows. So that curiosity has to develop into adaptive intelligence, and we need to develop digital literacy into AI fluency. So, of course, all this creates some challenges. And I think one of the key challenges I'd like to highlight, and this goes back to my conversation with Tosha Thurman at SAP and my wider research, we've had billions of dollars spent on software tools, but it's not being matched in any way, shape or form by the investment of people. And that is a big part of the adoption problem. And I'll give you a simple example that I found fascinating. I was listening to a podcast with a chap called Jeremy Utley, who I'm going to mention in a slide that's coming up. He interviewed the CEO of the business Automation Anywhere. And this CEO highlighted the fact that we've not had an improvement in business productivity since the year the iPhone came onto the shelves. Think about that, that's 2007. There were improvements in business productivity. And by the way, he measured it in terms of the amount of employees it takes to produce $1 million of revenue. That was the measure he was using. But there's been no improvement in that ratio since 2007. Imagine how much money has been spent on software in that time and the advances in technology, yet we've not achieved any meaningful improvement in productivity. Quite a surprising and alarming thought, that really. So that is a point I want you to think about carefully with your teams. Now, we've all heard the phrase about AI, or you won't lose your job to AI, you might lose your job to somebody using AI more effectively. But I think there's a lot of fear around the uneducated on the subject of AI. And that creates resistance to experimentation, it creates resistance to change. And that is something which a lot of people have not been educated on what AI can do just yet, are wrestling with. And I think the shame is once you start to embrace it and give it a try, it becomes such an exciting journey to learn what it can do for you. That's definitely something which a lot of organisations are wrestling with. And that ties in with the whole issue of compliance, which of course is so vital in procurement, because there's a lot of uncertainty out there about what is safe usage. So you might have Copilot in your organisation if you're a Microsoft house, and you've got some limitations on what you can and can't do with Copilot. So people might want to experiment with Google Gemini or GPT or Perplexity or whatever your model of choice. And the reality is, I think a lot of people are not quite sure what they can and can't put into those models. And that either creates potential for cybersecurity issues or data breaches, but it also limits people's mindset about what they can and can't experiment with. So I think that's something which we need to overcome. And I actually know I think there's a very simple solution to that personally, and it's actually using AI to try and flesh out a policy for you and your organisation to use as a guideline. But as a result, and this is a phrase that perhaps is more relevant to what's coming rather than where we are right now, but as a result, talent confidence doesn't match job spec expectations. What do I mean by that? Well, job specs are going to evolve. We'll touch on that shortly. I've got an experiment I'm running about what job specification is going to look like in a few years' time. Again, I'll touch on that in a moment. But people aren't confident in their job ability to do that. And I think the most simple example I can give you of that is when I spoke at an event in February, I asked everyone to raise their right hand if they felt equipped to thrive in an era where digital and AI tools were common in their organisations. And no one raised their hand in the audience. And at least half the people came up to me after the presentation wanting to ask me questions about how to get started on this journey, which I think tells you its own story. So we've got some good news for you, better news. We've got some potential solutions. And we want to look at how to make adoption stick, because I believe the investment in the people, the point I made on my first slide, is vital to how you win with technology. So this is really my learnings from lots and lots of presentations at some great events that I attend, particularly Digital Procurement World. And when you listen to the organisations that are really making great strides forward with their adoption of digital and AI tools, they talk about creating a curiosity-led culture which encourages experimentation. It makes people feel safe to ask, safe to fail, not feeling any consequences of that. And that environment really encourages people to try different things, and then they go on this learning journey and they start to remove the barriers to change and upskill themselves in the process. And I think good examples of that, perhaps the most high profile one in Europe is BT Digital Garage. And they've created a structured experimentation environment. And so in very simple terms, their scouting team will go out into the market to find tools that could potentially solve a specific business problem. And they'll run a proof of concept through their incubator capability. And the idea is they do a quick, fast experiment. And if they fail, no problem. It's okay to fail fast. We have to learn more when it goes wrong. But if we're successful, well, then, of course, then the question is how do we roll it out to the wider organisation? And that is not unique to BT. There's lots of other examples, many of them actually in the pharma sector, that are creating these structured experimentation environments and that curiosity-led culture. And those two go hand in hand in my experience. I think that's a very desirable objective to try and get to that point with your organisation. A couple of ways you might want to think about doing that. So I saw the CPO Bristol Myers Squibb speak at Digital Procurement World in Amsterdam last October, and she gave a great example of how she'd sparked innovation in her team. So what she did was she took various different people across your organisation, put them into teams, often not with people that work on a day-to-day basis, so sort of embracing the idea of diversity, get people with different voices and different ways of thinking across these individual teams. And the idea was it was competition. And again, to quote the sort of BT example, find a business problem, scout the market for a solution, come back, make a presentation, try and work out the ROI, and a competition to see who won the prize. Now, of course, that was good. They found a business problem that could solve and a solution to try it with. But more importantly, I would argue, was that the mindset shift. So you had the people who are very excited about this, leading the way. Others that perhaps were initially resistant, but felt as if they'd got to be dragged along, otherwise they'd be embarrassed by not taking part. And then you sort of throw yourself into learning different things, learn what's possible, and eventually you get this positive momentum to all this. And really, that changes mindsets, it upskills people, and it removes barriers to change. I think that's a very important part of a very important way to embrace these sort of these principles. Another one that I quite like, and this goes back to our research, the idea that when an emerging talent is hired to start a career in procurement, they historically in the past they might have been raising invoices, POs, and that sort of thing. But actually, those jobs have been automated now. So how do you get them started? And the idea was from our research that several CPOs mentioned was you had a procurement excellence function. The emerging talent would move around that excellence function, working with experienced practitioners. The emerging talent, a digital native, growing up with a phone in their hand, like the Gen Zers that are coming to the market, the workplace now. They bring a mindset of technology. They could then work with more experienced people, learn from them about procurement and all the different things about the business, but also rub off on the more experienced people about what technology can do. And together they learn together, complementary skills, a win-win. So that sort of buddy system, I think, is one which a lot of people are using quite effectively. So there's some things you can start thinking about long term, but the good news is I've got a really quick win for you. So in the run-up to New York, being completely candid with you, I felt I need to really upskill myself on AI in order to be credible in the conversations I was hoping to have with software leaders and procurement leaders and consultants at that event in New York. And so I embarked on a campaign of really learning more about what AI could do. And the more videos you watch on YouTube, of course, the more it feeds you relevant content. So one Friday evening, I was sat on the sofa waiting for my wife to join me to watch our latest Netflix series. She was just on the phone to a friend. I thought I'll turn on YouTube, and I saw this there. You are using AI completely wrong. Now, I'm not normally one for clickbait. I don't like it, but I thought, go on, I'll buy it. I'm going to New York in a few weeks. I better just sort of see if this has got any interesting information for me. And that chap you can see there is a chap called Jeremy Utley, and he teaches at Stanford. And he teaches about AI and creativity. And this video, I think, has had 13 minutes of the most important 13 minutes in my professional career for a long time. And so what I do with this video, it's so impactful on me. I've shared it with a lot of people in my network, procurement leaders, software leaders, consultants, and I always ask them what they find the most impactful of what Jeremy shares in this video. And the three things that I think are most impactful are there listed on the right-hand side. So let's take them one by one. So in his research at Stanford, Jeremy compared people who used AI and thought of it as a colleague versus those, this is generative AI, by the way, so ChatGPT, etc. How do you think of it as a colleague to collaborate with it versus those that use it as a traditional software tool? And in their study, they found that the people who collaborated with it as a colleague or as an intern, for example, really had a much higher performance level with generative AI than those who treated it as a tool. So when you start to think of it in that way, it can be transformational, and that's certainly been the case for me. Then the definition of creativity, several people picked this out, and one in particular, Chief Products Officer of a very respected ProcureTech vendor, picked this out and he thought it was fascinating. And this is really important because the definition of creativity, Jeremy's team surveyed a group of grade school kids in the States, and a 7-year-old from Utah, I think it was, says the definition of creativity is not accepting the first outcome. And this is really important with AI because I think as humans we're often wired to take a quick route to the outcome we want. But actually, if you embrace iteration with generative AI and you really drill down and challenge it, you get much better outcomes. So I think people just think one prompt and then they've got the answer. That's not the way to go. And this is my point about AI fluency. Previously, the more you understand how the model works and how to embrace its power, then you're moving from AI literacy into AI fluency. And finally, the point that is most impactful on me, and I think that a lot of people just don't realise, is that you can get AI to train you. So Jeremy Utley says, look, Excel can't train you to use Excel, but AI can train you to use AI. And if I have a consultation with it, you can understand your level of competence. It can give you advice. It can rewrite your prompts for you. It can really do all sorts of different things you don't realise. It can be a career coach, a strategic thought partner. And so once you embrace these principles, it's a real game changer with generative AI. And being the lovely guy that I am, there's the QR code for the video. I suggest next time you've got 13 minutes spare, you watch it, and if you do, please message me on LinkedIn or via email. I'd love to know which bits of it you found impactful, because I'm actually keeping a tally on that, and at some point I may well produce some research on it. So this slide comes from one of the most impactful presentations I've seen for quite some time at DPW in New York last month. And a lot of these findings come from one particular presentation, but they're supported by others that I took some examples from. But the presentation was made by a chap called Aditya Chalapalli. He works for Microsoft. He's a teacher at MIT and also at Stanford, so quite a CV, or should I say resume for an American. And bear in mind, this conference was predominantly set up for software vendors to share their stories about what their software can do, with a big emphasis on AI and getting people excited about what AI can do in procurement. He sounded a very cautionary note because he presented some research that he'd been involved in, which covered the adoption of AI tools across enterprises, covering more than just procurement functions. So sales, HR, etc. are all in there. And in fact, sales is perhaps the most mature in terms of adoption of AI. I think he described procurement having great potential, but potential was so far unfulfilled. And these were categories that had got enthusiasm, if you will, from CPOs. So 90% of CPOs were keen to try orchestration, and these categories you can see on the screen now, between 70 and 90% into the companies trialing them. So just take a moment to look at those if you would do. And so when you've got up to 90% of CPOs trying, unfortunately, the success rate in proof of concepts and pilots was as low as 35%. But even more alarmingly was the fact that when it actually came to rolling out those proofs of concepts across the wider organisation, the success rate dropped to 5%. But there was more bad news, because he told us that in 90% of those cases where these things hadn't worked out successfully, the finger of blame was pointed predominantly at the actual software tools. So the actual technologies were to blame in the eyes of the enterprise organisation. That's a very, very uncomfortable listening for the people in the room at that point. There were other factors, and if you watch the video, which is now available on the DPW website, I really would recommend you do that if you've got half an hour spare. Key areas like organisational resistance to change and a lack of capability in the team, obviously two subjects we're touching on today, were in there. But, the finger of blame was pointed right at the software vendors, and that was pretty uncomfortable listening at the time. However, he did share with us, and indeed others did, some positive takeaways, which I'm going to share with you now. And these are my strategic recommendations for CPOs. And so these are the things we learned. We found that, there is a shift in the way procurement needs to buy software moving forward in the AI era. Historically, when you bought tools that are procured to pay, source to contract, or other business softwares, you bought on a per seat license model. The AI native companies now that are presenting their solutions are trying to move towards value and outcomes. Now, I think that is an ongoing discussion at the moment. No one's quite nailed exactly what this means. I think it's a conversation for the procurement people and the software people. And indeed, I was actually involved in a conversation about this yesterday. But ultimately, this is a shift in the buying mindset for procurement about how you pay for these softwares, and of course for the software companies and how they charge for it as well. But what Aditya presented in his finding was that the successful pilots had a few things in common, and one of them was that the ones that have been successful were very tightly focused on specific workflows where the agents could actually control the process, albeit with human oversight, of course. But very tightly defined workflows. That's where the success came. And I think the broader and the woollier the workflows, the less success there was. So I think that's something to really think about in your future experiments. And he also made the point that the ones that were really impactful were the high value ones, so things that delivered big savings or big efficiency improvements. And of course, that's a great place to start, because if you're going to go to the CFO or the COO with a business case for future investment, if you're armed with a very successful project that's had a real financial impact, of course, your voice is going to be that bit louder. In terms of a mindset shift, besides the buying model, I think they also talked about positioning tech vendors as co-builders rather than suppliers. So if you think about the landscape right now, a lot of these AI native businesses are startups. They are very, very keen to win their first high-profile customers and take those stories to market. And so if you catch them early, you've got a much higher chance of working very collaboratively with them to really influence their product and have it effectively almost bespoke to your capabilities. And so if you treat them as co-builders, seeing out innovation, if you will, from your supplier base, rather than suppliers that you might have a very different relationship with, you're much more likely to be successful, particularly if you can tightly define those workflows that you want to address. And of course, the moment you start to employ agents, then the whole landscape shifts within your operating model and the job profiles that you've got. So then you're into a point which really is backed up by a lot of what I've talked about today, which is making talent strategy part of your digital strategy. I think those two can no longer be in isolation. My point earlier about the underinvestment in people versus technology, that can't go on anymore. You've got to do the two in parallel, and we'll look at more about that in a moment. So those are some recommendations. There are many more that I could share, and we'll produce some thought leadership on that in due course. But I think hopefully some good starting points for you there. So we're talking about a change in operating models, and are you ready for this AI-powered operating model that's coming, where it's really changed by orchestration? And of course, we hear that word a lot in procurement now, a number of high-profile orchestration software providers these days. And so I thought I'd embrace that and give you the conductor as this image, and I've chosen that particularly because I think that is the role of the procurement leader in future. Because if you think about the orchestra, the job of the conductor, of course, is to get all those different parts of the orchestra playing in harmony to produce a great performance. That's your role now as a procurement leader, because if you think about, for example, a classic category manager, their job is going to change and they're going to be orchestrating agents that are doing part of the category management process for them. Similarly, if you've got a spike in workload because you've got a particular sourcing project on, you can use AI as embedded contingent labour. Historically, you might have hired a contractor to do that. Now you've got an agent to do part of it, and the category manager's got to deploy that agent in parts of the process that they can be successful. And so you can deal with those spikes in workload, and that agent can then theoretically be moved to a different project at a later date. If you get to a stage where you're building multi-agent systems, you can then support much more insightful decision-making processes. And at this point, you start to think about, if you think about AI as augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, enabling humans with more insights and information and capabilities to make better decisions, then you start to understand that having a raft of agents across the organisation could be quite a desirable place to land. But then, of course, once you're doing that, you've got to rebalance your teams to focus human effort on value creation, because they're no longer time constrained by all the tasks that they used to do that can now be automated or run by agents. They're actually able to focus on the value add, which goes back to the skills I mentioned earlier on strategic and critical thinking, business partnering. Of course, that's long been the sales pitch of all these software vendors. We'll do the heavy lifting, you do the value add. Now's your opportunity. So I think that is something which is fun to think about. And in terms of what it's going to look like as an operating model, I'm just in the process of completing a brief for an experiment that I want to run with a select number of procurement leaders, where we're going to use generative AI to really look at what this could look like using creative thinking, intellectual curiosity, what this could look like in the future, both in terms of the operating model and how that will change job profiles. You start with a prompt that we've written, and then we'll give some guidance as to how you might go through the process, but you use your own instincts and creativity to arrive at the end result. You want to do that, and we want to do that as an experiment. So if you want to take part in that, please do get in touch. We're looking to recruit the contributors right now. So what does that mean for future workforce planning? Well, I've already made the point that digital strategy and talent strategy have to be hand in hand. And if you're going to change your operating model, you should think about what your future workforce is going to look like. And so you're into the realms of designing your team for an AI augmented future. And really, I've made that point already that the planning must be tied to your transformation goals. I think I don't need to go into that any further. But I think when I've been asked to speak about future workforce planning in the past, we've touched on post-pandemic issues of people moving from the offices to the home. So you've got hybrid models, you've got distributed teams, particularly in international organisations. And then, of course, now we've got Gen Z entering the workforce, we've got boomers hanging on and everything in between, so you've got multi-generational teams. All those things create challenges for leadership. and they're still there, but the landscape shifted significantly with the age of the agents. And so now, to take something from a respected CPO that I saw speak at an event in London last month, she talks about that she'd always like to have a T-shaped talent, and I thought it was a really good point about this whole era. So if you don't know what that means, the top of the T is the breadth of multidisciplinary expertise that you've got, all those skills we talked about earlier, all those capabilities, all those mindsets. But then the vertical part of the T is that depth of expertise, that functional proficiency, or a technological proficiency or functional depth that I talked about earlier in our research, where you've got some with deep capability in a specific area. I think when you think about your future teams, that might be a good model for you to consider. Okay, so problem over the camera. Okay, and so because you're thinking about building your roles around humans and agents, and you've never done that before, you've never thought in that way before, and this is why this experiment I'm going to do, I think, is really interesting to see what that means in terms of job profiles will look like and how that shifts the skills conversation. But as leaders, you need to prepare for orchestration. You are going to be the conductors of the orchestra, and you need to think about that. You've historically run teams of people. Now you're running teams of people and agents, or teams of people who are running agents. That is a shift in your skill set. And not just within procurement, you've got to recognise that this is going to be across your organisation. And so your digital and AI strategy in procurement is part of a wider digital and AI strategy. And that's part of your AI fluency. That's part of your digital literacy. And something that you need to think about in terms of your own personal development. And many of us have seen that phrase that we're not quite sure where it came from. Now it's become ubiquitous. You won't lose your job to AI. You might lose your job to somebody using AI more effectively. That's a whole uncomfortable debate, which we haven't got time for today. But unfortunately, the reality is that some people are not going to be willing or able to get on this journey. And so you've got people in your team, or you might have people in your team, certainly your organisation, who might need to be invested in terms of retraining or creating internal mobility pathways. So they're going to go into roles that are more suited to their capabilities in this era. And that's something which you perhaps need to be thinking about in terms of how you move to a more agile operating model and ultimately have the team you need to thrive in this new era. So a few thoughts here there on future workforce planning. Which brings us neatly to my favourite subject, the battle for talent, because now, you're not just competing on tech anymore, you're competing on culture, or rather, I should say, you're not competing on tech, you're competing on culture as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the past, when I spoke about the battle for talent in procurement, it started off with the battle between procurement teams for very highly desirable category expertise. It might be big areas of indirect spend like IT or marketing, professional services. And a big part of my career has been dealing with that battle for talent, finding people with those skill sets. And then we talk about emerging talent, the battle for graduates, for example, for between procurement and other areas that have got similar skill sets like finance or sales. That was the battle for emerging talent that's been going in procurement for quite some time. But the landscape's shifting now, because we're not the only profession going through our own AI revolution. Of course, there are many others. And then you've got industries that, quite frankly, are a lot sexier and potentially more lucrative than procurement. So in the States, you've got the gambling industry with huge growth. We've got gaming, we've got social media, we've got sport, all theoretically sexier and potentially more lucrative than procurement. So how do we get our fair share of bright young talent into the profession? And that's a big challenge. Because particularly when you bear in mind that Gen Z evaluates digital maturity when choosing employers. And I know this very well. My daughter graduated earlier on this month. I've met with all friends to talk about their careers. They've sought guidance from me. And, these people have grown up with a phone in their hand, a smartphone in their hand from a very young age. And they are not going to work with organisations that have got, archaic legacy tech. They want to work in organisations where they can use the technology skills they've developed and they can really thrive in that environment. And so AI fluency will define your brand as an employer and also your leadership credibility. If you're a leader who thinks, we'll leave the AI fluencies to people who are actually working with the agents, I don't need that, I've got other priorities as a leader. Imagine being sat in front of a great talent that you want to bring into an organisation, and they start asking you about your use of AI and you've not got any answers. Are they going to come and work for you? Just thought there for you. So you have a hard time attracting top talent if you've not got the right plan for all this and the right journey that you're on. But furthermore, if you're slow to adapt, not only will you struggle to bring in great people, you also run the risk of losing your best people to organisations that are more progressive in these areas. And that's a real risk for a lot of organisations who are slow to adapt on this. So that's something for you to think about. But I've got some good news for you. I do have a potential solution. So I mentioned the BT Digital Garage earlier as being a great example of a company at the forefront of embracing technology and procurement. And I think that their story is an interesting one to observe, and there's other organisations doing similar, but they're the most high-profile example I can think of. And really, if you imagine it, whether you're starting your journey tomorrow inspired by this, or you're already on this journey already, you need a plan for where you're going to and how you're going to get there. And that is your story about your transformation. The journey is what's exciting. The end result will keep moving forward as technology changes. So the journey is what's exciting. Good people want to be on that challenging environment where they can progress, learn new skills, tackle different problems and projects. And so having a story you can sell is a very important part of future talent attraction. And then, so once you've got that story, once you've got that plan, then how you got to sell it's really important. So in the BT case, they do a great job on LinkedIn, but they've also got their own course in Dublin University. So they're doing a great job of getting the local talent from their best local schools. But also there's things that you can do, like go and speak at events. I've talked about some great visionary CPOs. I just completed a piece of work for a CPO where we completed the management team. But one of the team that works with it, he got directly with somebody who came to him because he'd seen him speak at a Cooper Inspire event and thought, I want to go and work for that guy. And he ended up hiring him. So you can really have a strong message to the marketplace if you embrace social media, local schools, events, conferences, etc., and put yourself in the shop window. So that's something you can do. And if you want some advice on developing that strategy, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. So there we go. An awful lot to get through in a short period of time. A lot of that's been superficial without going into too much detail. I make no apologies for that because I wanted to try and get as much in as I could in a relatively short space of time. If you want to keep the conversation going, you can get my LinkedIn there, or you can get me at everydaley.com. Please follow us on YouTube if you don't already. Loads more great content of this type there, and more coming as we develop our research in these areas. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for watching.